Here is a standard law exam scenario. Emily, highly intoxicated, is caught pushing a skateboard along a public road. She is charged under Section 12 of the Licensing Act 1872, which states it's an offense to be drunk while in charge of any carriage. To convict Emily, the magistrates must answer a highly specific legal question. Can a skateboard legally be defined as a carriage? If you try to solve this by opening a dictionary and guessing what the word means, you will fail the exam. In the English legal system, answers are deduced by applying the Doctrine of Precedent. The formal name for this doctrine is stare decisis, a Latin term meaning let the decision stand. It dictates that courts must treat like cases alike. Operating this way serves two exact purposes. First, it ensures predictability, allowing citizens to know what the rules are. Second, it guarantees fairness, preventing different judges from handing out varying punishments for the exact same conduct. To determine Emily's fate, we have to execute a three-step process. We must isolate the binding rule in past judgments, navigate the hierarchy of the courts, and master the technique of distinguishing facts. When you master stare decisive, you stop guessing at definitions. You learn to extract the active mechanics of past rulings and use them to engineer legal outcomes. A court judgment is a long, complex text explaining why a party won or lost. Every word a judge says is part of that judgment, but only a fraction of those words form binding law. This diagram illustrates how we dissect a case. At the very top, we filter out the noise to isolate the material facts. These are the specific, legally relevant facts that are absolutely essential to the outcome. The application of the law to those specific material facts creates the ratio decidendi. This translates to the reason for the decision. It is the core legal principle that binds future courts. Everything else falls under obiter dictum, meaning of those things said. Judges often speculate about hypothetical scenarios or write dissenting opinions. These comments might persuade future courts, but they carry zero binding power. We can apply these definitions to the 1995 test case of DPP v. Johnson. Here, the court faced a specific issue. Does a defendant who has alcohol injected into their body satisfy the definition of consuming alcohol under the Road Traffic Act? The judges reviewed the statute. They acknowledged that the primary definition of consuming involves drinking by mouth. However, they reasoned that the context of the Road Traffic Act is broad enough to cover other methods of introducing alcohol into the body. This gives us our ratio. The binding legal rule is that consuming is not restricted to drinking, but expressly includes the introduction of alcohol into the body by injection. During their ruling, the judges also speculated that a person could theoretically consume alcohol by inhaling it. Because inhalation had nothing to do with Johnson's specific situation, that statement remains entirely obiter. The boundary between fact and law is precise. While a breathalyzer reading is a finding of fact, the legal definition of consume is a proposition of law. Only the latter creates a binding precedent. Isolating the ratio is only the first step. That principle is useless if it comes from a court that lacks the jurisdictional power to bind the judge hearing your current case. This flowchart maps out the hierarchy of the English legal system. The strict baseline rule is vertical. Superior courts absolutely bind all courts below them. At the top, decisions made by the UK Supreme Court flow downward, establishing binding precedent for every other court in the system. At the opposite end of the spectrum are the lower courts, such as the magistrates' courts. Because they handle thousands of first-instance decisions, their rulings bind absolutely no one. This strict adherence to past rulings creates a tension. If superior courts are bound to follow their own precedents, the system risks becoming trapped by its own historical errors. For decades, the highest court was trapped by its past rulings. It finally broke that deadlock in 1966, when the Lord Chancellor issued a practice statement, granting the court the power to override itself. This power is used sparingly. The Supreme Court will only depart from its own past decisions when it appears right to do so to prevent severe injustice.
For instance, in the case of RVG, the court explicitly overruled a previous test that convicted defendants based on what a hypothetical reasonable person would have foreseen. Moving one tier down, the Court of Appeal faces tighter restrictions. To maintain commercial and civil stability, it remains strictly bound by its own past decisions. However, in the case of Young v. Bristol Aeroplane, the court established strict lateral exceptions to this rule. The Court of Appeal can break its own chains if two of its past decisions conflict, if a ruling has been implicitly overruled by the Supreme Court, or if the past decision was made per incurrium, meaning through carelessness or ignorance of a binding statute. The rules flex slightly depending on what is at stake. Because human liberty is on the line, the Criminal Division of the Court of Appeal holds slightly wider discretion to depart from precedent than the Civil Division, as established in R.V. Gould. We can now return to the Magistrates' Court to resolve Emily's skateboard dilemma. To secure a conviction or an acquittal, we must find a binding precedent from a higher court that addresses the word carriage. We locate a precedent in the 1951 High Court case of Corkery A. Carpenter. The issue there was whether a person pushing a bicycle while drunk was in charge of a carriage under the exact same licensing act. Rather than relying on a literal dictionary definition, the High Court looked at the purpose of the statute. They determined the law was designed to protect the public from intoxicated individuals operating conveyances on public roads. Because a bicycle transports people and poses a danger when controlled by someone impaired, the court established a clear ratio. A bicycle is a carriage, and pushing it while drunk is a criminal offense. This is where we deploy the tactical tool of distinguishing. If you can prove that the material facts of your current case vary significantly from the precedent, the court can refuse to apply the historical ratio. Emily's fate depends on how we frame the rule from Corkery. If we argue for a narrow ratio, that a carriage strictly means a bicycle, Emily is acquitted. If we argue for a wide ratio, that a carriage means any wheeled vehicle, she faces conviction. The defense must actively argue the factual distinctions between the two modes of transport. A bicycle has mechanical brakes, is designed for primary transport, and carries the rider. A skateboard lacks brakes, requires constant foot-to-ground contact, and is primarily a leisure item. Therefore, the danger to the public is drastically different. Law is not a matching game, where you plug facts into a formula. The core mechanism of legal advocacy lies in identifying these factual variances and arguing whether a precedent's ratio should be stretched to include new facts or shrunk to exclude them. Distinguishing facts serves as the primary engine for modernizing entire branches of commercial law without discarding the architecture of precedent. In 1809, the case of Stilk v. Myrick established a bedrock rule of contract law. Merely performing a duty you are already legally contracted to perform does not constitute valid consideration for an extra payment. Nearly 2 centuries later, the 1991 case of Williams v. Rafi Brothers tested this rule. A building subcontractor threatened to stop working unless the main contractor paid them extra money simply to finish the project on time. The Court of Appeal realized the strict 1809 rule ignored the realities of modern commercial renegotiations. They couldn't simply overrule a bedrock precedent, so they distinguished the facts. They refined the ratio. The court held that because the main contractor received a practical benefit, specifically avoiding severe financial penalties for finishing late, that practical benefit counted as valid consideration. The English legal system functions through this structural tension. It maintains order through strict vertical hierarchy, yet evolves through the lateral flexibility of exceptions and distinguishing. When you sit down to write a legal exam, remember this mechanic. Examiners will penalize you for simply reciting definitions. Top marks go to students who actively debate wide versus narrow ratios, and who use material facts to argue exactly why a historical precedent should, or should not, control the present.